Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In this lesson, we're going to be concluding our discussion of the different regions of English settlement, concluding with the Southern Colonies, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about life in the colonies in general and some of the broad factors that shaped that era. So remember, we've already discussed the Chesapeake, New England, and the Middle Colonies in previous lectures, and so in this one we're going to be focusing on the South. So the Southern Colonies were established as restoration colonies, like some of the ones we talked about in the previous lecture. The Carolinas were created by charters issued in 1663 and 1665. And initially they attempted to follow the model of the Chesapeake and Maryland, but they underwent some struggles, and the establishment of the city of Charlestown in 1680 provided some stability. But it was really the advent of a plantation society driven by slavery that lent stability and eventually prosperity to South Carolina. South Carolina was not settled by the English directly. Rather, it was settled by men from the West Indies, who sought out South Carolina as a source of raw materials to supply their plantations in Barbados. Barbados is a small Caribbean island without much wood or raw supplies, and so these settlers initially came to South Carolina to raise cattle and harvest timber for barrels or ships and provide raw materials for their settlement in the Caribbean. Because Barbados was already rooted in a slave society, slavery was introduced in South Carolina immediately, and slaves very quickly became a majority of the South Carolina colony, and ultimately slaves were a much larger portion of the population than any other colony. South Carolina also featured absentee land ownership during parts of the year. During the hot, disease-filled summer months, plantation owners would migrate either inland or away to escape the heat, leaving their plantations to be run by overseers. North and South Carolina, incidentally, were divided from very early on in 1729, and there were differences between the two colonies as North Carolina was rooted less in a slave plantation economy and more in small farms or other industry. The last of the original colonies to be settled was Georgia. It was created to serve initially as a barrier between Spanish Florida and the English colonies. It was also intended as a safe haven for growing numbers of innocent people in debtors' prison. It was established in 1732 by a land grant to James Oglethorpe. Oglethorpe initially maintained strict control of the colony, but eventually found it impossible to control the settlers, many of whom were impoverished or former prisoners. Eventually, the colony evolved a slave-holding economy similar to that of South Carolina. So now you've got an understanding of the different regions of colonial settlement and the different characteristics and kinds of people that were settling there. So let's talk a little bit more broadly about life in the colonies under the empire. And even as I say that, I should remind you that early on, the colonies were not part of the empire. They were private investments, and so they were governed by charters issued by the crown. However, each of these charters included clauses that if the colonies suffered hardships, the crown could step in and seize control. And ultimately, that is exactly what happened. And it's going to be the control being exerted by the English crown that down the road will lead us toward revolution. So we're not there yet, but that is a factor to keep in mind. Now, the colonies were also influenced by events back in England. First and foremost, the English Civil War, which ended in 1660. And you might recall in the previous lecture, I described that as the restoration. At the end of the Civil War, Charles II was restored as king, and he wanted to instill the image of a strong monarchy. And so extending control of the crown over these colonies in far-flung lands became part of that mission. And so once again, we're going to see the extension of control as an incentive of the English government, and ultimately that is going to cause trouble for the colonists. So it is under Charles II that the economic relationship known as mercantilism was developed. In simplest terms, mercantilism meant that the colonies existed solely for the financial betterment of the imperial power. Sometimes we call England the mother country. So, and of course, the colonists would not necessarily have viewed themselves this way, but from the vantage point of the English crown, the colonies were there solely to provide raw materials to England and a market for other goods. So any and all profit being generated in the colonies would have been targeted by the English, and they would have sought out ways to tap into that. So we see developed in this period what is sometimes known as the triangle trade, which essentially is organized to direct any resources back to England and any kind of money that can be generated back to England. As this relationship evolves, we see England pass a series of laws that are going to govern the economy of the colonies, beginning with the Navigation Acts in 1660, which said that colonists cannot employ foreign shippers, and that some items can only be sold to England. In 1663, England passed another act that colonists can't import anything directly from Europe, it must be from Britain itself. Other acts follow, all of which are designed to close the economic circle, to make the empire self-sustaining and direct any and all wealth generated by the colonies back to the motherland of England. So from what we've known of the colonies in our lecture so far, we can recognize that they are confronted with a number of challenges. And these challenges are going to mount as the colonial era goes on, and we're going to be talking about these more in the next couple of lectures. But to summarize some of the challenges confronting the colonies, we've already talked about some examples of Indian relations. These are a difficult issue throughout the colonies, and we see different responses in the different colonies. We also see that the colonies are challenged by imperial officials. The development of the mercantilist system, which I discussed just a moment ago, and the imposition that is put upon colonists by those officials. And these kind of conflicts are going to mount. There are also a wide array of internal conflicts within and between the colonies themselves. And we'll talk about some of these going forward. Conflicts between those on the western frontier or the highlands versus coastal regions. Debtors versus creditors. Farmers versus merchants. Clergymen versus laity. And newly arrived wealth versus established wealth are just a few of the conflicts that we're going to be talking about going forward. In essence, all of these kind of challenges are going to mount as the colonial era goes on and eventually will erupt in a series of social upheavals and conflict, which I'm going to be discussing in the next lecture.